I want to really put this whole problem in perspective. But before I do, I want to give the history lesson. But a lot of people don't even know where the debt ceiling came from. It's not like it was part of the Constitution and we've always had a debt ceiling. No, the debt ceiling was first enacted in 1917, right? That was the year the United States entered the First World War. And it wasn't a coincidence that happened, because when we got into the war, the government needed to borrow a lot of money. They started borrowing a lot of money to pay for the war. And so Congress got a little worried about all the borrowing. And so they put a ceiling. They passed this debt ceiling. So look, this is the most you can borrow. And the ceiling actually applied to specific maturities. So it wasn't like a blanket ceiling. There was a limit on 1-year treasuries. There was a limit on 10-year, right? Depended on the maturity. They were very specific about how much you could borrow. And then also what happened in 1917 rather, was they amended the Federal Reserve Act, which had been passed in 1913. And in the original Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve was not even allowed to own U.S. treasuries. I mean, forget about buying them. They couldn't even own them. They couldn't even be part of their balance sheet. Now, that's the opposite of today. I mean, that's their whole balance sheet. But when the Federal Reserve was first conceived, and Congress agreed to pass the Federal Reserve Act, it was with the stipulation that the Federal Reserve that they were creating would never own U.S. treasuries. Because if they had proposed the Federal Reserve from the beginning and said, hey, it's going to buy U.S. treasuries, they never would have passed the act. The only way they can get it through was to put it through where they couldn't buy treasuries. But that is an example of the camel's nose under the tent. You never want to let the nose under the tent, because before you know it, you got this big stinking camel in the tent. And that's what happened with the Federal Reserve. That same thing happened with the income tax, right? That started as a soak to rich tax on the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the Carnegies. And now all of a sudden, middle-class Americans are paying a tax that was for the billionaires, right? But so the Federal Reserve, they got this thing passed by saying it's not going to buy any U.S. government bonds. No, don't worry about that. It's not going to be an engine for debt and inflation. It's not going to help the government finance its deficits. It's going to be an independent central bank. Well, the minute World War I rolls around, all of a sudden, the government needs money. Now, of course, we never should have got into World War I, and that's a whole new podcast. And in fact, had we not gotten into World War I, we probably wouldn't have had a World War II. So, and I don't have time to really go down that rabbit hole, but we go into World War I, and Congress needs money. And they got this Federal Reserve that they just started a few years ago, and it's like, aha, great, we'll borrow from the Federal Reserve. Oh, we can't. Oh, we got to amend the Federal Reserve Act so we can borrow from the Fed, so the Fed can buy treasuries. And now, because it's a war, congressmen were willing to vote for something that a few years earlier in peacetime they never would have voted for. See, that's what happens. When there's a war, the government uses that crisis to usurp power because they appeal to patriotism and to people's desire for safety. That's why we really lost World War I, as far as I'm concerned. We lose every war, because in every war, we lose economic freedom. Talking about the income tax, the withholding tax didn't start until World War II. In 1942, they passed the victory tax. And in the victory tax, there was a 5% extra income tax, right? Extra tax to win the war. Now, at least back then, when we had a war, the government acknowledged that we had to pay for it. And they raised taxes on everybody to pay for the war. Recently, when we have a war on terror or the Iraq war or whatever we do, nobody's taxes goes up. Nobody has to pay for it, right? That's why nobody really objects to these wars, because nobody has to pay for it, right? In fact, we have a war and the presidents tell you to keep spending. We had World War II. Roosevelt said, stop spending. You got to buy these war bonds. You got to pay higher taxes. Everybody's got to stay home and hunker down. Stop spending, right? We have a war to pay for. Wars cost money, right? Now everybody thinks wars are free because we just print the money. So in 1942, we passed this victory tax, and the money is withheld right from your pay. It had never been done before. Before 1942, nobody paid any income tax until April 14th. You wouldn't pay a dime in 2022 taxes until April of 2023. That's when you would figure out how much you made the previous year, and you would send the government a check. Nobody had taxes withheld from their pay until 1942 with the Victory Tax Act. Then in 1943, they passed another tax hike for the war effort, but this time they said that all taxes, all income taxes, not just the victory tax, but all of your income taxes, 100% are going to be withheld from your pay by your employer. And if you're self-employed, that's when quarterly estimated taxes began. So before 1943, nobody filed estimated tax returns. Nobody paid quarterly. But starting in 1943, everybody started doing that. Now, why? Because we were at war. The government couldn't wait to the following year for your money. They need the money right now. They needed to support the troops. So there was an urgent need for your tax money. And so the government was able to take it right out of your pay or have you pay it every quarter as opposed to one time in the following year. Now, here's the problem with these wartime powers. World War II ended. I mean, it was in all the papers if you didn't hear about it, but it ended in 1945. Well, they never ended the withholding tax. We had the victory, but the victory tax is still here in a sense that we still have the withholding that nobody had until World War II. So now the government has all this money coming in peacetime. What did it do with it? It found ways to spend it. That was the problem. And you know, today taxes are so high. If they didn't have tax withholding, there's no way the average American would be able to pay his tax. Can you imagine today if Americans got their entire paycheck like they did in 1930, 1940? They got all their money, nothing withheld. And then they just had to write a big check to the U.S. government the following April 15th. How many Americans, the way we spend, would actually have any money? Nobody. So the only way they can get away with collecting a tax that's so high is because of withholding. And the only reason we have withholding is because we had World War II. You know, so if you think we need tax withholding, then you got to think we needed World War II. Because without World War II, we wouldn't have had it. But anyway, I've been digressing a couple of times, but I want to get back to the point that I actually started to try to make about the debt ceiling. So they amended the Federal Reserve Act so that the Federal Reserve could own treasuries, right? It doesn't buy them direct from the Treasury. It buys them in the open market, which is almost the same thing, except some Wall Street banks get to make some money because they get a commission on all the treasuries that go from the U.S. Treasury to Wall Street, and then they get flipped to the Federal Reserve, right? So it's a cozy little relationship. It's nice business if you can get it. You know, I've never been able to get those orders myself, you know, being in the brokerage business because I'm not in that club. But that enabled the government to run up all these debts. But also part of the reason I think that Congress wanted the debt ceiling limit, not only was it a war, but a lot of them realized that the Fed was going to be buying these bonds, and they were worried that relationship where the Fed can now buy treasuries would encourage the Treasury to go deeper into debt, knowing that if the Fed was going to be able to buy the bonds. And so we had a debt ceiling. And the first debt ceiling, I think, was like $5 billion. That was all it was. And they quickly raised it. They raised the debt ceiling again. So it was the Liberty Bond Act where they initially had the debt ceiling in 1917. And then later that year, they had the second Liberty Bond Act, which increased the debt ceiling within the same year. And then in 1939, right, this is on the eve of World War II, which we didn't officially enter until 1941, but it began 1939. It was kind of obvious that we were heading in that direction. That's when they changed the debt ceiling. Instead of having limits on individual maturities, it was just one overall limit on the debt, which is what we have today. But that's been going on since 1939. But now, because we've raised the debt ceiling every time we've neared it or we've suspended it, which was something that started more recently. You know, they didn't even have the guts to raise it, so they suspended it, right? Because people, you know, sometimes at the polls, your opponent might use your vote to raise the debt ceiling against you. And so nobody even wanted to raise it, so they just suspended it, so they couldn't be accused of raising it. But because we did this so many times, we have $32 trillion of debt, and it's going to keep on growing. I don't care about these Republicans who claim that they don't want to raise the debt ceiling. I mean, it's all politics. They had a chance. I criticized them. The Republicans voted 3 times under Trump to raise the debt ceiling, even when they had both houses of Congress. They had an opportunity not to raise the debt ceiling, but they didn't. They raised it. What did they do when they had the House and the Senate? They increased government spending, and that is what's driving the debt, is the spending. The Republicans increased welfare spending, and they increased warfare spending, and they raised the debt to pay for it. So who are they kidding? They don't want to do anything about the debt. When push comes to shove, the debt ceiling is going to get raised.